American Horror Story's last venture was Cult, looking at what happens when an enigmatic personality gets a step too far and things turn deadly. It's an interesting premise, especially considering it's using the 2016 U.S. presidential election as its starting point, but it's not exactly unique. There are plenty of famous cults that have popped up over the years, like Jonestown, the Order of the Solar Temple, and so many more. But sometimes it's the lesser-known ones that are more horrifying. Plenty of them go on for years, if not decades, because they manage to fly under the radar. A couple of them are still around to this day. Here, for your listening pleasure, is a selection of some of the weirdest, scariest, and most terrifying cults that you may or may not know about. So, close the blinds, dim those lights, cuddle under your favorite blanket, and let's begin. Number 1. The Anthill Kids. Roque their alt ran a small doomsday cult in Ontario, Canada. Between 1977 and 1989, exercising absolute control over a dozen adults and at least 26 children, most of whom he'd fathered himself with his 9 concubines. Before getting kicked out of the Seventh-day Adventists, Therault had amassed a following by organized detox seminars for people trying to quit smoking or drinking. He convinced several of them to quit their jobs and leave their families to live with him in the wilderness, dubbing them the Anthill Kids because of how hard he demanded they work. And when I say demand, I mean he forced them to break their own legs with sledgehammers if they refused. Though he failed to predict the end of the world in 1979, Therault successfully became a sadistic cult leader, demanding absolute loyalty and punishing naysayers and doubters. He nailed children to trees, made his followers eat their own feces, and when angered, he stripped them down and beat them, plucked their hairs out one by one, and many other forms of abuse. He also refused to take anyone to the doctor, instead performing surgeries himself without anesthesia, which resulted in one woman's death from pulling out her intestines. He also killed a child during a fatal circumcision, and one more died after being left outside during a blizzard as punishment. It wasn't until 1989 that Gabrielle Lillie, having been brutally mutilated by Therault on more than one occasion, finally escaped and contacted authorities. Therault was given a life sentence, but he was killed in 2011 by his cellmate. Still, a good portion of his followers never recovered from their abuse and have continued to obey his teachings. Number 2. The Carney Cult. It's a case of you can't sit with us gone horribly, horribly wrong. In 1991, a traveling carny named William Alt found out that a couple of his co-workers were involved in a cult called Satan's Disciples, and he wanted in. The only problem was Mark Godwin, Jimmy Panek, and brothers Keith and David Lawrence didn't want him in their club. Alt, not wanting to give up on being one of Satan's disciples, decided to blackmail the group with his knowledge that Panek and Keith Lawrence had killed an 18-year-old boy earlier that year. Only it didn't actually work on the group. The 5 members of Satan's Disciples drove Alt out to a secluded area, told him to lie on a makeshift altar, and then proceeded to mutilate and torture him. After tying and gagging Alt, the group invoked Satan before cutting an inverted cross into his body and killing him. They later cut off his head and hands, then tried to burn him. When that failed, they dumped his body in a field. Godwin's father found the body, told police, and the cult was arrested shortly after, serving between 8 to 60 years for their crimes. Number 3. Kashi Ashram. In the 1970s, a New York housewife saw visions of Jesus and 2 Hindu spirit guides, gave herself a new name, and started her own religion. Jaya Sati Bhagavati was the founder of Kashi Ashram, a spiritual group that became famous in the 1990s and early 2000s, and was beloved by celebrities like Julia Roberts. The religion promised kindness and compassion, but ex-members accused Jaya of turning herself into a deity, telling followers the guru is greater than God. According to the investigation in the Miami New Times, dozens of former Kashi residents accused Jaya and the movement of physical abuse, psychological control, kidnapping, and sexual assault. These most likely included beatings, either performed by Jaya herself or ordering someone else to do it. At one point, she reportedly punished a boy whom a member had molested by beating him, then painting his genitalia black and making him parade around the grounds of their compound. Jaya was also obsessed with children, possibly as a result of having several miscarriages with her second husband. Former members reported having to ask Jaya's permission to have kids, and some of them were convinced into handing over their babies to her for training. At least 4 mothers from 1978 to 1982 listed Jaya and her husband as biological parents on their child's birth certificate. But the worst offense had to be when Jaya forced her 14-year-old daughter to marry an adult member of the church, ordering her to have sex with him and then checking to see if she was pregnant. Jaya may have died in 2012, but her legacy has not. Kashi Ashram still exists to this day. Number 4. The Fall River Cult. It all started when the body of 17-year-old sex worker Dorian Levesque was found outside a Massachusetts high school. Her wrists were bound with fishing line, and she had been horrifically beat and sexually assaulted. Police originally suspected one of her clients had done it, but 1 year later, the body of another sex worker was found on a makeshift altar. Later, a sex worker named Karen Marsden came forward, fearing for her life, claiming that pimp Carl Drew and sex worker Robin Murphy, who was also Marsden's girlfriend, were responsible for the murders. Marsden said Drew and Murphy were part of a devil-worshipping prostitution ring, and that they performed rituals and human sacrifices deep within the forest. She was worried that she could be the next victim for cooperating with the authorities, though they didn't take her concerns seriously. 6 months later, Marsden's body was found, or rather, her toothless skull. Drew was arrested in April of 1980 and charged with Marsden's death, while another man, Andrew Maltese, was charged with a connection to one of the other murders connected in the alleged cult. Murphy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and got a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony against the others. However, there are those who believe Murphy was the real mastermind behind the ritualistic killings. Others think that the murders weren't actually devil worship and were sensationalized because of the satanic panic of the 1980s. Maltese died while behind bars. Drew has maintained his innocence during his entire stint in prison, claiming Murphy was responsible. Most recently, she was denied parole in March 2017 because the parole board thought she was untrustworthy. Number 5. Superior Universal Alignment. Valentina de Andre was the leader of the 1980s UFO cult called Superior Universal Alignment in a remote part of Brazil. She claimed to receive messages from the extraterrestrials that God didn't exist. Rather, Jesus was an alien, and he was going to send a spacecraft to save his true believers from the end of times. However, her prophetic beliefs came with one caveat. All boys born after 1981 were possessed by evil and had to be purged. At first, DeAndre simply demanded that some couples turn their children over to other couples, grandparents, or other guardians, so they'd qualify to leave on her spacecraft. However, that didn't turn out to be enough, and things became violent. Between 1989 and 1993, members of Superior Universal Alignment are believed to have sexually assaulted, mutilated, or killed at least 19 boys between 8 and 13 years old. 6 of them died, and 5 were never found, while the rest escaped, though some have been drugged and mutilated, included castration. It took 11 years for Brazilian police to gather enough evidence to bring DeAndre to trial, along with 4 male members of her cult, many of whom were prominent citizens in the remote Amazonian community. While all 4 of the men connected to the boys' murders were sentenced to decades in prison, DeAndre was acquitted of all charges because she wasn't in the area when the crimes were committed. And weirdly enough, DeAndre's Superior Universal Alignment still has an active presence online. Number 6. Marcus Wesson, the Vampire King. In 2004, 57-year-old Marcus Wesson stepped out of his house in Fresno, covered in blood, and police knew that something had gone horribly wrong. Piled in the back of the house were the bodies of 9 of his kids and grandkids, surrounded by antique coffins. For decades, Wesson had cultivated and controlled an incestuous family of followers through manipulation and physical abuse. He followed his own spiritual practice that combined Christianity and vampirism, believing that Jesus Christ was actually a vampire and that the end of times would be upon them when a police officer arrived at their door. Wesson kept his sons separate from his daughters and refused to let them socialize with each other, in fear that they would develop sexual feelings for each other. This is primarily because he considered himself God, and all his daughters were his future wives. Wesson started marrying his daughters in 1974, sexually abusing them as children so that they could bear even more kids for him. It is believed he fathered about 18 children through 7 women, 5 of whom were young girls at the time. After Wesson had declared that he planned to move his daughters and their kids to Washington State, several members of his extended family, along with 2 nieces who had rebelled against him, showed up to his compound and demanded he release the kids. The police were called, believing it was a standard custody battle, but it soon turned deadly. Wesson was found guilty of 9 counts of murder and several counts of rape and sexual assault. He's currently sitting on death row. Alright, my lovely lilies, thank you so much for watching the new video. If you can, hit that subscribe and like button, comment below and tell me your thoughts. Also, don't forget to tap the little notification bell so you're always in the know on this channel. As well, guys, you can always find me on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and always you can hit me up in my emails. Feel free to send me your stories, whether they're fiction or totally true. I'm always up for some great stories. And oh, by the way, until next time, sweet dreams.